The radio signal crackled through the static at exactly 23:47 hours on October 14, 1944. In a concrete bunker beneath the streets of war-torn Berlin, a young radio operator named Friedrich Weber pressed his headphones closer to his ears, trying to make sense of the desperate Morse code bleeding through the interference. His pencil trembled as he transcribed the dots and dashes into letters, then words, then a message that would haunt German naval intelligence for decades to come. The transmission originated from somewhere in the North Atlantic. From U-boat U-1206, a Type 7C submarine that had departed Kiel Harbor 5 weeks earlier on what should have been a routine patrol. The message was brief, encrypted with the day's coding sequence, and ended with 3 words that made no sense according to standard naval protocol. Weber decoded the message with practiced efficiency, his fingers automatically working through the substitution cipher that all German naval communications used. The first part was standard distress protocol, position coordinates, nature of emergency, current status. But those final 3 words stopped him cold. He read them again, certain he had made an error in translation. But no, there they were, clear as daylight, despite the crackling static. "See you tomorrow." The phrase appeared nowhere in the official German naval codebooks. It wasn't a recognized distress signal, it wasn't a standard tactical communication. It was simply personal, human, a message that seemed to slip through the rigid military formality like a ghost passing through walls. Weber immediately passed the message up the chain of command. Within an hour, it reached the desk of Admiral Karl Dönitz himself, commander of the German U-boat fleet. Dönitz read the decoded transmission 3 times, his weathered face betraying no emotion beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. He had seen thousands of such messages during the war, desperate final transmissions from U-boats about to die. But this one was different. Those 3 words at the end suggested something beyond standard military communication. A search was ordered immediately. Every available U-boat in the area was directed to proceed to the coordinates provided in the transmission. British naval activity in that sector was monitored through what remained of German naval intelligence. But the North Atlantic in October was a vast, hostile wilderness of grey water and darker storms. Finding one disabled submarine in thousands of square kilometers of ocean was like searching for a specific grain of sand on an endless beach. Days passed, then weeks. No further transmissions came from U-1206. No wreckage was found. No survivors were picked up by either German or Allied forces. The boat simply vanished as if it had never existed. Eventually, U-1206 was officially listed as lost with all hands, another entry in the growing ledger of German submarine casualties that by 1944 had reached catastrophic proportions. But the mystery of that final transmission remained. Naval intelligence analysts pored over the message, searching for hidden meaning. Was it code, a reference to some pre-arranged signal, a religious phrase? Various theories were proposed and discarded. The boat's captain, Kapitänleutnant Klaus Hoffmann, had no history of unconventional behavior. His service record was exemplary, professional, competent, reliable. Not the sort of officer who would deviate from protocol even in extremis. The 3 words were filed away with the rest of U-1206 records. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion and Germany collapsed into rubble and defeat, the mystery was forgotten in the larger catastrophe. 43 men had sailed aboard U-1206 when she left Kiel. 43 souls who joined the 28,000 other U-boat crewmen who never returned from patrol. In the calculus of total war, their deaths were just numbers. Their final message, just another curiosity in files that would gather dust for decades. But the ocean remembers. Deep beneath the cold North Atlantic waters, 300 meters down where sunlight has never penetrated and human eyes cannot see, U-1206 rests in eternal darkness. Her steel hull is slowly being consumed by rust and time, transformed degree by degree into iron oxide and memory. Schools of deep-sea fish drift through her torn compartments where men once lived and worked and died. Her torpedoes, never fired in anger, rest in their tubes like sleeping dragons. Her engines, which once drove her through hostile seas at 17 knots, are now just corroding metal being slowly reclaimed by the ocean. And if submarines could speak, if steel could tell stories, U-1206 would tell a tale of courage and catastrophe, of impossible choices made under impossible circumstances. She would tell the story of 43 men who departed Kiel Harbor on a grey September morning, full of fear and duty and desperate hope. She would explain what those 3 final words truly meant, "See you tomorrow," and why they became both a promise and a ghost that haunted the dreams of those who survived. This is that story. This is the truth behind the mystery. This is the last voyage of U-1206. September 10th, 1944, dawned cold and overcast across northern Germany. The sky hung low and oppressive, the color of wet concrete, promising rain that would not come for hours yet. In the naval port of Kiel, what remained of the Kriegsmarine's once proud U-boat fleet prepared for another day of the losing war. The harbor bore the scars of Allied bombing raids like a battered prizefighter who refused to fall. Warehouses stood gutted and roofless, their walls blackened by fire and pocked with shrapnel damage. Dry docks sat empty or held the broken remains of submarines that would never sail again. Oil slicks shimmered on the water's surface in rainbow patterns of poison and decay. The very air tasted of smoke and defeat, and the peculiar metallic scent of a port slowly dying. U-1206 floated low in the dark water near Pier 7, her grey hull still wet from the morning dew. She was a Type Civ IC submarine, the workhorse of Germany's underwater fleet. 67 meters long, 6 meters wide, capable of diving to 150 meters depth. Her hull was constructed of riveted steel plates, each one fitted with precision, sealed with rubber gaskets, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. 2 diesel engines provided surface power, while electric motors drove her when submerged. She carried 14 torpedoes, a single 88mm deck gun, and enough provisions to keep 43 men alive for 6 weeks at sea. But unlike her sister boats scarred by depth charges and machine gun fire, U-1206 looked almost pristine. Her hull bore no battle damage. Her conning tower showed no repair work. Her deck was unscratched by the passage of countless boots running to battle stations. The crew had started calling her Die Jungfrau, the Virgin, because she had never fired a torpedo in anger, never tasted real combat, never proven herself in the brutal mathematics of submarine warfare, where the average boat lasted exactly 2 patrols before being sent to the bottom. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Hoffmann stood on the conning tower, watching his crew conduct final preparations for departure. At 32 years old, he carried himself with the particular weariness of men who have seen too much death too young. His blonde hair showed premature grey at the temples. Deep lines framed his ice-blue eyes, not laugh lines, but the kind etched by constant stress and inadequate sleep and the weight of command that pressed down like physical force. He wore his service uniform with the careful precision of a man who knew appearances mattered, even when everything else was falling apart. The crew moved across the deck below him with practiced efficiency, their movements economical and sure despite the early hour. Crates of provisions were passed hand to hand down the forward hatch, canned meat, dried vegetables, coffee, bread that would be fresh for perhaps 3 days before going stale and mouldy. Torpedoes had been loaded the previous night, each one carefully winched aboard and secured in its tube or storage rack. Fuel tanks had been topped off, batteries fully charged, every system tested and retested according to the exhaustive checklist that governed submarine operations. Watching them work, Hoffmann thought about the statistics he wasn't supposed to know but did anyway, because information always leaked through military bureaucracy like water through cracks. Of the 1,162 U-boats built by Germany since the war began, over 700 had been sunk. The mathematics were brutally simple. The Allies were destroying U-boats faster than German shipyards could build them. Crew losses had become unsustainable. Of the 30,000 submariners who had gone to sea since 1939, nearly 28,000 would never return. The U-boat force was dying by degrees, sacrificed to a strategic vision that had been obsolete for 2 years. but continued through sheer bureaucratic momentum and Hitler's refusal to accept reality. And yet here they were, preparing for another patrol. Another voyage into the killing grounds of the North Atlantic, where Allied aircraft hunted from above and destroyer groups prowled beneath. The mission briefing had been typically optimistic: proceed to Grid Square, BE-47 north of Scotland, interdict Allied convoy traffic, sink enemy shipping. But the subtext was clear to anyone who bothered to look. They were being sent out to die because that's what U-boats did in 1944. They went out and they died, and occasionally they took an enemy ship with them, and the mathematics of attrition ground everyone down into the same grey slurry of defeat. Hoffmann pulled a crumpled cigarette from his uniform pocket, one of his carefully hoarded supply of real tobacco, rather than the ersatz garbage that passed for cigarettes in wartime Germany. The match flared orange in the grey morning, a tiny point of warmth and light. He inhaled deeply, drawing the smoke into his lungs, holding it there as if it might be his last breath of free air. The nicotine hit his system and provided the illusion of calm for perhaps 30 seconds before reality reasserted itself. Below on the pier, families had begun gathering despite regulations that discouraged such displays. They always came anyway, drawn by the same desperate need to fix one final image in memory just in case. Wives stood wrapped in coats against the morning chill. Children clung to their mothers' hands, too young to fully understand, but sensing the adults' tension. Mothers and sisters and sweethearts waited with forced smiles and eyes that betrayed their terror. Hoffmann spotted his own wife immediately. Margaret stood apart from the other families, maintaining the rigid self-control that was her armor against the world. She wore her navy coat with the silver buttons, the good one she saved for important occasions. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her high cheekbones and the stern beauty that had first attracted him 15 years ago when they were both students at the university in Heidelberg. She held herself perfectly still, but even from this distance, Hoffmann could see the slight tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite suppress. Their 2 sons were not with her. 8-year-old Karl and 6-year-old Friedrich had been sent to stay with Hoffmann's mother at her farm in Bavaria, far from the bombing that had already destroyed much of Munich. Margaret had decided the boys should not see their father depart on another patrol after the last time, when Karl had cried for 3 days straight, and Friedrich had started wetting the bed again from anxiety. She had made the decision unilaterally, and Hoffmann had not argued because she was right, and they both knew it. The memory of that last goodbye still cut like broken glass. Karl asking when Papa would come home. Hoffmann promising soon, very soon, knowing it was a lie even as the words left his mouth. Friedrich asking why Papa had to go away again when he had just returned from the last patrol. No good answer to that question, just duty and orders and the machinery of war that consumed men without regard for fatherhood or childhood, or any human consideration beyond the immediate tactical necessity. Hoffmann finished his cigarette and flicked it over the side of the conning tower. It fell the 4 meters to the water below and hissed into extinction. A tiny death that seemed almost ceremonial in its finality. He watched it sink beneath the oily surface and disappear, taking his momentary peace with it. The Oberleutnant zur See Werner Fischer appeared at the base of the conning tower ladder, clipboard in hand, his young face showing the careful seriousness of junior officers trying to prove themselves worthy of their rank. Fischer was 24 years old, with dark hair and brown eyes that still held traces of idealism that the war hadn't yet beaten out of him completely. This would be his first combat patrol as first watch officer, the second-in-command position that made him responsible for navigation, watch schedules, and taking over command if something happened to the captain. Fischer climbed the ladder with precise movements and came to attention at the top. His uniform was immaculate despite the early hour, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his cap set at exactly the regulation angle. He saluted crisply and waited for acknowledgement before speaking. Hoffmann returned the salute and gestured for Fischer to proceed with his report. The young officer consulted his clipboard and recited the readiness status with the mechanical precision of someone who had rehearsed the words multiple times. All crew members present and accounted for, 43 souls including the captain, all supplies loaded according to the manifest, all torpedo tubes loaded and ready, fuel tanks at full capacity, batteries fully charged, all mechanical systems tested and operational. The boat was ready to depart on the captain's order. 43 souls. Hoffmann hated that phrase with visceral intensity. It reduced his men to abstract units, currency to be spent in the calculus of naval warfare. But they weren't souls or units or statistics. They were human beings with names and faces and families waiting back home. They were Hans Becker, the torpedo specialist with 3 young children. Otto Brandt, the baby-faced radio operator whose father had died at Stalingrad. Ludwig Hartmann, the engine room chief who had survived 3 previous sinkings through skill and luck in roughly equal measure. Every single one of them was someone's son. Many were husbands and fathers. All were irreplaceable to someone who loved them. And in roughly 6 weeks, statistically speaking, most of them would be dead. Hoffmann acknowledged Fischer's report and ordered him to assemble the crew for final inspection. Fischer saluted again, descended the ladder, and disappeared into the submarine through the forward hatch. Within minutes, men began flowing up from below decks and arranging themselves in the tight confines of the boat's interior spaces for the captain's traditional pre-departure inspection. Hoffmann took one last look at the grey sky and greyer water before descending into U-1206's cramped interior. The smell hit him immediately upon entering. That distinctive U-boat stench of diesel fuel and machine oil and human sweat, and the peculiar metallic scent that all submarines carried like original sin. Some old hands claimed it was the smell of compressed fear. Hoffmann thought it simply smelled like death deferred. The crew stood at attention throughout the boat's length, packed into every available space between equipment and supplies and the 1,000 pieces of machinery required to keep a submarine operational. They ranged in age from Otto Brandt at 19 to Ludwig Hartmann at 40, though the war had aged all of them beyond their chronological years. They wore the standard U-boat uniform, grey coveralls, rubber-soled boots, watch caps. Most were already growing beards, since shaving was difficult aboard submarines, and most captains permitted relaxed grooming standards after departure. Hoffmann began his inspection at the bow and worked aft, checking each station and each man with practiced efficiency. He had conducted this same inspection dozens of times on previous boats and knew what to look for. Equipment properly secured, men properly trained, any signs of obvious problems that needed addressing before departure. But more than checking equipment, he was reading faces, gauging morale, trying to assess whether this crew was psychologically prepared for what lay ahead. In the forward torpedo room, he found Hans Becker supervising his loading crew. Becker was 28 years old, with the build of a wrestler, and hands that had loaded more torpedoes than any other man in the Kriegsmarine. Each of the weapons weighed 1,500 kilograms and required careful handling to prevent accidents that could destroy the boat. 4 were loaded in the bow tubes, ready to fire. 10 more were secured in storage racks, held in place by chains and clamps that would hopefully prevent them from breaking loose if the boat took violent maneuvers or depth charge damage. Becker reported his station ready with the calm professionalism of a career non-commissioned officer who knew his job inside and out. But Hoffmann could see the tightness around Becker's eyes, the slight pallor beneath his weathered tan, the way his jaw muscles clenched. Becker had 3 children at home, Helga aged 7, Kurt aged 5, and baby Anna barely 2 years old. He was supporting them on a torpedo man's pay, while his wife Maria tried to keep them fed in a country where food rationing grew more severe every month. Becker needed to survive this patrol and return home, but the odds were increasingly against anyone aboard a U-boat in late 1944. Moving aft through the narrow passageway, Hoffmann passed through the cramped officers' quarters where he and 3 other officers would sleep in bunks stacked 3 high in a space no larger than a decent-sized closet. Personal effects were secured in tiny lockers. A fold-down table served as desk, dining surface, and chart table depending on need. Privacy was non-existent. Officers learned to sleep through each other's snoring, flatulence, and nightmares with studied indifference born of necessity. The control room represented the submarine's brain, a cramped space dominated by the periscope, diving plane controls, ballast tank levers, depth gauges, and the 1,000 other instruments required to operate a submarine. Obersteuermann Friedrich Müller stood at the diving station, his weathered hands resting lightly on the wheel that controlled the bow planes. Müller was 42, ancient by U-boat standards, grey-haired and lined like old leather from nearly a decade of submarine service. This was his 27th patrol. He had survived 26 previous voyages through some combination of skill, caution, and the kind of luck that couldn't be quantified or predicted. Hoffmann asked Müller how many patrols he had promised his wife he would complete before retiring. Müller replied 20, then 25, and now here he was on number 27 because someone had to train the young idiots who kept getting assigned to U-boats with minimal training and no combat experience. His voice carried bitter humor without malice. They both knew why experienced men like Müller couldn't retire. The U-boat force was bleeding veterans faster than training programs could replace them. The galley occupied a space barely larger than a phone booth, but Smutje Paul Richter had made it his domain through 5 years of submarine service. At 35, Richter had been a chef in a Berlin restaurant before the war. Now he performed daily miracles, transforming canned horse meat and weevil-infested flour into meals that kept men's spirits from completely collapsing. He reported his provisions stocked according to the manifest. Enough food for 43 men for 6 weeks, assuming careful rationing and that nothing spoiled prematurely. Fresh bread would last perhaps 5 days. Fresh vegetables maybe 3 days before going bad. After that, it would be canned everything and dried potatoes prepared in endless variations until the crew was sick of potatoes but ate them anyway because there was nothing else. The engine room belonged to Leitender Ingenieur Ludwig Hartmann, 40 years old with grey hair and hands permanently stained black with oil and grease. The space was dominated by 2 massive MAN diesel engines, each capable of producing 1,400 horsepower and driving the boat to 17 knots on the surface. The noise when running was deafening, a constant thundering roar that made conversation impossible without shouting directly into someone's ear. The heat was oppressive, regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius despite ventilation fans running at maximum. The machinists who tended these mechanical monsters worked shirtless and emerged from their shifts looking like coal miners, covered in sweat and oil and soot. Hartmann reported both engines operating within normal parameters. The electric motors that drove the boat when submerged were also tested and functional. The batteries that powered those motors were fully charged. He had enough fuel and spare parts to keep everything running for the duration of the patrol, assuming they didn't encounter mechanical problems beyond his ability to repair. That last caveat hung in the air like smoke because mechanical problems were not a question of if, but when, and Hartmann's ability to improvise repairs with limited tools and spare parts would likely mean the difference between life and death at some point during the coming weeks. The medical station consisted of a cabinet containing bandages, sulfur powder, morphine, some basic surgical instruments, and a bone saw. Sanitator Wilhelm Koch, the boat's medic, was not a doctor. Real physicians rarely served aboard submarines. Koch was a 30-year-old sailor who had completed 3 months of first aid training and now bore responsibility for treating everything from seasickness to compound fractures to sucking chest wounds. His expression as he showed Hoffmann the medical supplies suggested he understood exactly how inadequate those supplies would be if someone suffered serious injury or illness. He would do his best, but his best might very well be watching men die while being unable to do anything beyond administering morphine to ease their passage. The radio room was Otto Brandt's domain. At 19, Brandt looked even younger than his age, with red hair, freckles, and a baby face that made him appear approximately 14. But his Morse code skills were exceptional. He could send and receive 60 words per minute with accuracy that bordered on supernatural. His fingers seemed to dance across the telegraph key with their own intelligence, translating thoughts directly into dots and dashes without conscious intervention. Brandt reported all radio equipment functioning properly, codebooks synchronized with U-boat command headquarters, ready to receive and transmit on the captain's orders. But behind his professional demeanor, Hoffmann could see the fear in Brandt's young eyes. His father had died at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. His mother had come to the pier yesterday to see him off, and Hoffmann had watched from a distance as she clutched her only surviving child and wept openly while Brandt stood rigid and embarrassed by the public display of emotion. Completing the inspection required nearly an hour as Hoffmann moved through every compartment, checked every station, spoke briefly with every man. When finished, he returned to the control room and assembled all off-watch personnel for his traditional departure speech. They crowded into the available spaces, faces turned toward him expectantly. Some were veterans who had survived multiple patrols and knew exactly what lay ahead. Others were young recruits on their first combat voyage, still believing in propaganda about U-boat aces and glorious victories. All of them were about to enter a level of discomfort, danger, and psychological stress that no training could adequately prepare them for. Hoffmann did not offer them false hope or patriotic platitudes about serving the fatherland. He told them the truth as he understood it. They were U-boat men. They would execute their mission with skill and courage. They would honor the memory of every boat that had gone before them. And they would do everything humanly possible to come home alive because surviving was the only victory that ultimately mattered. The speech was brief, factual, and entirely honest about the dangers they would face. Some of the younger men looked shaken when he finished, but the veterans nodded approval. Hoffmann had not insulted their intelligence with lies about certain victory or righteous causes. He had simply acknowledged the reality they all understood, but rarely spoke aloud. After dismissing the crew to their departure stations, Hoffmann remained in the control room for a moment of solitary contemplation. He thought about the statistical probability of any individual U-boat surviving a patrol in 1944. He thought about the families waiting on the pier above. He thought about his wife and sons and the life he might never return to. He thought about the burden of command and the knowledge that his decisions would determine whether 43 men lived or died. Then he pushed those thoughts aside, climbed back to the conning tower, and prepared for departure. The time for reflection had passed. Now there was only the mission ahead, and the ocean waiting to claim them all if he made even a single mistake. The families gathered on the pier represented 43 points of light in a darkening world. They stood in small clusters, wives with wives, mothers with mothers, finding comfort in shared anxiety while waiting for the moment when their men would disappear into the grey Atlantic and become statistical probabilities rather than flesh and blood. Margareta Hoffmann stood apart from the other families by choice rather than circumstance. She had attended enough of these departures to know the ritual intimately, the forced cheerfulness, the promises to write, the awkward silences when conversation failed and everyone simply waited for the inevitable separation. She had no patience for that performance anymore. Her husband was leaving on another patrol where the odds of survival barely exceeded 1 in 5, and she would not pretend that forced optimism changed those mathematics in any meaningful way. She watched the submarine preparations with the analytical detachment of someone who had seen this scene play out too many times. Crew members scrambled across the deck, making final checks. Officers consulted clipboards and barked orders. The diesel engines rumbled to life with a deep mechanical growl that resonated through the pier's wooden planks. U-1206 was coming alive, transforming from an inanimate object into a predator preparing to hunt. Margaret had driven up from Munich 2 days earlier, leaving their sons with Klaus's mother at the farm in Bavaria. The boys had begged to come to see their father one more time before he departed. She had refused. Karl still had nightmares from the last farewell, waking up screaming about his father drowning. Friedrich had regressed to bedwetting and thumb-sucking, behaviors he had outgrown years earlier, but which returned whenever his father disappeared aboard a submarine for months at a time. She understood her sons' need to see their father, but she also understood that watching Klaus sail away into probable death would traumatize them further, and she had decided that protecting them from that trauma was more important than satisfying their need for one last goodbye. Klaus had agreed with her decision without argument, which somehow made it worse because they both knew what his acquiescence implied about his own survival expectations. The night before departure, they had lain together in the small hotel room near the naval base, neither sleeping, both pretending to sleep to spare the other from conversation neither wanted to have. At some point past midnight, Klaus had started to say something that began with, "If something happens," before Margaret had cut him off sharply, refusing to let him voice the goodbye he was preparing to offer. But in the pre-dawn darkness, as they dressed in silence, she had finally broken her own rule. She had asked him directly why he continued accepting these suicidal patrols when Germany was obviously losing the war, when U-boats were being slaughtered wholesale by Allied defenses, when his survival seemed less likely with each voyage. Why not request a training position or a desk assignment, or simply refuse orders and accept whatever punishment came? Klaus had answered with the tired patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. He commanded U-1206. 42 men depended on his leadership. If he refused the assignment, some other officer would take command, and that officer might lack the experience or skill to bring those 42 men home alive. It was duty, yes, but more than abstract duty. It was personal responsibility for specific human beings whose survival depended on his competence. He could not abandon them to potentially inferior leadership just to save his own life. Margaret had wanted to scream that his responsibility was to his family first, to his sons who needed their father more than 42 strangers needed his expertise. But she had bitten back those words because they both knew that particular argument had no resolution. Klaus defined himself through military service and duty. Asking him to abandon that identity was like asking him to stop breathing. He would not do it, could not do it, even if it meant dying for a lost cause while his sons grew up fatherless. Now she stood on the pier, watching her husband on the submarine's conning tower, smoking one of his carefully hoarded cigarettes, and she felt nothing but a tired acceptance of the inevitable. He would depart. He would probably die. She would receive the official telegram expressing sympathy for her loss. She would raise their sons alone. Eventually the war would end, and she would try to rebuild some kind of life from the ruins. It was all so predictable that she almost felt bored by the tragedy of it. The ship's horn sounded, 3 short blasts that echoed across the harbor, the signal for final boarding. Crew members who had been saying goodbye to families began moving toward the submarine. The moment had arrived. Klaus descended from the conning tower and walked down the gangway toward where Margaret waited. His face showed the careful control of someone who had practiced suppressing emotion until it became second nature. But she had known him for 15 years, since they were students together at university, and she could read the fear and doubt behind his professional mask. He stopped in front of her, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other without speaking. All the important things had already been said, or remained unsayable, and words seemed inadequate to the moment. Around them, other families were embracing and weeping and making promises they might not be able to keep. Klaus and Margaret simply stood facing each other like two people meeting for the first time and trying to memorize each other's features. Then Klaus broke protocol and military propriety by pulling her into his arms in full view of his crew and the other families. She stiffened for just a moment. Public displays of affection were not done, especially not by officers, before melting against him and allowing herself this brief moment of vulnerability. He was warm and solid and real, and in a few minutes he would be gone, and might never be real again beyond memory and photographs. He whispered something against her hair about seeing her tomorrow. It was their private phrase, the thing he always said when departing for patrol. A small defiance against fate and probability. A refusal to acknowledge goodbye as permanent. She whispered it back automatically, the ritual response that had become as natural as breathing over the years of repeated separations. But this time the words felt hollow. See you tomorrow implied confidence in survival, and Margaret felt no such confidence. Statistics and rumors and the steady stream of widows being created by this war had eroded her faith in Klaus's invulnerability. He was skilled and experienced and careful, yes, But skill only delayed the inevitable when facing overwhelming odds. Eventually, probability caught everyone, and Klaus's luck had held far longer than reasonable expectation suggested it should. They broke apart after perhaps 30 seconds, long enough to violate professional decorum, but short enough to avoid being actually scandalous. Klaus stepped back, straightened his uniform with automatic precision, and formally saluted her as if she were a superior officer. The gesture was so absurd that Margaret almost laughed, but the laugh died in her throat when she saw the expression in his eyes. He was memorizing her face the same way she was memorizing his, both of them creating mental photographs to carry into separation. Then Klaus turned and walked back toward the submarine without looking back. Looking back was forbidden by tradition. It was considered bad luck for submariners to look back at port when departing. Margaret thought the superstition was ridiculous, given that bad luck was virtually guaranteed, regardless of whether anyone looked backward or forward or closed their eyes entirely. But Klaus observed the tradition faithfully because he observed all traditions faithfully, as if ritual observance could somehow purchase safety from a universe that dispensed death without regard for proper protocol. Other crew members were saying their own farewells with varying degrees of composure. Werner Fischer held both hands of a young woman with auburn hair. His fiancée Greta, Margaret knew from Klaus's mentions. Greta was 3 months pregnant, though Werner had not reported this fact to his commanding officers because pregnant fiancées would have disqualified him from submarine duty. He was whispering something to Greta while she clutched what looked like a notebook against her chest. Margaret wondered if those were letters Werner had written in advance, to be given to his unborn child if he failed to return. The possibility seemed unbearably sad. Hans Becker knelt before 3 small children, 2 girls and a boy, ranging in age from perhaps 2 to 7 years old. His wife Maria stood behind them with the carefully composed face of a woman who had said this goodbye too many times already. The oldest child, a girl with blonde pigtails, was asking her father something repeatedly. Becker kept shaking his head and saying something that apparently failed to satisfy her questions. Finally, he just pulled all 3 children into a group embrace, while Maria watched with eyes that suggested she had already accepted her husband's death and was simply waiting for the official confirmation. Young Otto Brandt stood with his mother, a worn-looking woman in her 50s whose entire life story could be read in the lines around her eyes and mouth. She had already lost her husband to Stalingrad. Now she was sending her only remaining child off to probable death aboard a submarine. She clung to Otto with desperate intensity while he stood rigid and uncomfortable, embarrassed by her public display of emotion, trying to project masculine composure he clearly did not feel. His mother was whispering something repeatedly, prayers probably, or just please come home. Please come home, please come home, like a mantra that might ward off death through sheer repetition. The ship's horn sounded again, 2 blasts this time, 5 minutes to departure. The crew members began tearing themselves away from their families and moving toward the submarine. Wives were left standing alone or in small clusters, watching their men disappear into the steel hull that would either protect them or become their tomb. Children who were too young to fully understand began crying anyway, responding to the adults' emotional distress with their own confused terror. Klaus was already aboard, back on the conning tower, supervising the final preparations. He did not look toward the pier where Margaret stood. Professional protocol had reasserted itself, and he was now the submarine captain rather than the husband and father, playing the role that duty demanded, regardless of personal feeling. The gangway was pulled away from the submarine's hull. The mooring lines were cast off and hauled aboard. The diesels increased their rumble to a deep roar as power was applied. Slowly, almost reluctantly, U-1206 began moving away from the pier and toward the harbour mouth. On the pier, the families waved. Some maintained artificial cheerfulness, calling out final messages that probably couldn't be heard over the engine noise. Others simply stood and watched in silence, their faces reflecting the knowledge that they were very possibly witnessing the last time they would ever see their husbands, sons, fathers alive. Margaret did not wave. She simply stood perfectly still and watched the grey hull slide away into the morning mist. Klaus had not looked back, maintaining the superstitious tradition. She wondered if he was thinking about her at that moment, or if he had already compartmentalized his personal life into a mental drawer that would remain closed until survival or death rendered it relevant again. The submarine passed through the harbour mouth and began moving into the open Baltic Sea. Within minutes, the mist swallowed it completely. One moment the grey hull was visible, then it was just a shadow, then nothing at all. U-1206 had departed on its patrol, joining the hundreds of other submarines that had sailed into that same mist over the past 5 years. Most had never returned. The families began dispersing slowly, reluctant to leave even though there was nothing left to see. Some grouped together for mutual support, others walked away alone, wrapped in their own private grief and dread. Margaret waited until she was the last person standing on the pier before finally turning and walking back toward the hotel, where she would spend one more night before returning to Munich and attempting to resume the half-life that existed between Karl's deployment and his return or death. "See you tomorrow," Klaus had whispered. Tomorrow had become a mythical concept, a placeholder for a future that might never arrive. Margaret walked through the empty streets of Kiel and wondered if tomorrow would ever come, or if it would remain perpetually just beyond reach, a promise that could neither be kept nor broken because it existed only in the space between hope and despair. U-1206 moved through the Baltic Sea at 12 knots, following marked channels through waters that were theoretically friendly but never entirely safe. Even in German-controlled seas, mines drifted free from their moorings. Allied submarines sometimes penetrated this far east on intelligence-gathering missions. Aircraft could appear without warning from any direction. Vigilance was required always, even in waters that should have been safe. Hoffmann remained on the conning tower as Kiel harbour fell away astern. The coastline was barely visible through morning mist that refused to lift despite the approaching noon hour. The sea itself was grey and cold, matching the sky above in perfect monochrome. Temperature was perhaps 10 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill an unprotected human in less than an hour, but mild compared to what awaited them in the North Atlantic, where winter was approaching and water temperatures dropped below freezing. Fisher stood beside him on the conning tower, consulting charts and calling out course corrections as they navigated between marked navigation buoys. 2 lookouts scanned the sky and sea with binoculars, searching for aircraft or surface vessels that might pose a threat. Standard procedure required 4 men on the conning tower during daylight hours in potentially hostile waters: captain, officer of the watch, and 2 lookouts, each responsible for scanning a different quadrant. The planned route would take them north along the Baltic coast, then into the Danish Straits, then north again along the Norwegian coastline, while staying in relatively shallow coastal waters where they could quickly dive if enemy aircraft appeared. The voyage to their assigned patrol area would require approximately 4 days if everything went smoothly and they weren't forced to waste time hiding underwater from air patrols. Grid Square BE-47 lay approximately 200 kilometers north of the Orkney Islands, right in the shipping lanes where Allied convoys traveled between North America and Britain. It was prime hunting territory with near-constant merchant traffic. It was also one of the most heavily defended sectors in the entire Atlantic, with aircraft patrols, destroyer groups, and hunter-killer teams specifically organized to find and destroy U-boats. German naval intelligence reported that 4 U-boats had been lost in that sector in the previous month alone. Roughly 160 men dead in 30 days, an unsustainable casualty rate that suggested the mission was essentially suicidal. But orders were orders, and U-1206 would proceed to the assigned sector and attempt to sink Allied shipping while avoiding being sunk themselves. That was the job. That was what U-boats did until they didn't do it anymore because they were lying on the ocean floor with their crews entombed inside steel hulls slowly filling with seawater. After 2 hours on the surface, Hoffmann ordered a practice dive to verify that all systems were functioning properly. The diving alarm sounded throughout the boat, 2 short blasts of the klaxon that sent crew members scrambling to their stations. The lookouts raced down from the conning tower, followed by Fisher, with Hoffmann last, as was tradition and regulation. The hatch was slammed shut and dogged down with heavy mechanical latches that sealed it against the ocean's pressure. Water flooded into the ballast tanks with a roar like sustained thunder. The boat's angle changed as the bow planes bit into the water and pushed the nose down. The depth gauge needle began climbing, 10 meters, 15, 20. Hoffmann watched every instrument carefully, listening to the boat's sounds, feeling through the soles of his feet the subtle vibrations that indicated whether systems were functioning normally or developing problems. At 30 meters depth, he ordered the dive halted and the boat leveled off. They would remain submerged for 30 minutes to verify that there were no leaks, that all systems operated correctly, that the crew could perform their duties under actual diving conditions rather than just in training exercises. 30 minutes would tell him whether U-1206 was truly ready for combat operations or whether they needed to abort and return to keel for repairs. The boat held depth perfectly. No leaks appeared. The electric motors hummed smoothly. The air circulation systems maintained adequate oxygen levels. Everything functioned according to specification. U-1206 was combat-ready as far as mechanical systems indicated. But Hoffmann knew that mechanical readiness was only part of the equation. The other part was the crew's psychological state, their ability to function under extreme stress for extended periods, their capacity to maintain discipline and performance when terrified and exhausted and living in conditions that degraded both mental and physical health. That could only be assessed over time through actual operations. After 30 minutes, he ordered the boat to surface. Compressed air blasted into the ballast tanks, forcing water out and providing positive buoyancy. U-1206 rose toward the light, breaching the surface with a surge of white water. The conning tower hatch opened, and Hoffmann climbed back into fresh air that tasted impossibly sweet after even the brief time breathing the submarine's recycled atmosphere. They continued north through the afternoon and into evening. The sky darkened gradually from grey to black. Stars appeared, cold and distant. Hoffmann remained on the conning tower long past when he should have gone below to rest, unwilling to surrender these last hours of relatively open sky and unrestricted visibility. Fisher eventually came up with 2 mugs of coffee, real coffee from the supplies that would last perhaps 5 more days, before being replaced by the ersatz substitute made from roasted grain that tasted like burned dirt. Hoffmann accepted the mug gratefully and wrapped his hands around its warmth. They stood in silence for a while, 2 officers alone in the darkness, while 41 men worked below, tending engines and watching instruments and trying to sleep in bunks, stacked 3 high in compartments that smelled of diesel and sweat. Fisher eventually broke the silence, asking questions that Hoffmann had heard 100 times before from young officers on their first combat patrol. What was it like? How did you manage the fear? How did you keep the crew functioning when everything went wrong? Hoffmann answered honestly, rather than offering the reassuring platitudes that regulations and tradition suggested were more appropriate. He told Fisher that combat was terrifying chaos, where training took over because conscious thought shut down. He explained that fear was always present, but could be managed through focus on immediate technical tasks. He described how crews held together through mutual dependence and shared misery, rather than through patriotic loyalty or faith in leadership. Fisher absorbed this information with the serious attention of someone who understood that his life might depend on internalizing these lessons correctly. He asked about survival rates, about the reality versus the propaganda statistics published by the Navy. Hoffmann told him the truth. Approximately 20% of U-boats returned from patrol in 1944, which meant 80% were sunk with casualties, typically totaling 90% or higher. Fisher's face went pale in the darkness, but he nodded acceptance of these facts without trying to deny or minimize them. Eventually, Hoffmann ordered Fisher below to get some rest before his scheduled watch began in 4 hours. Fisher descended through the hatch, leaving Hoffmann alone with the sea and stars and his thoughts. He thought about Margaret standing on the pier that morning, her face carefully composed, but her eyes revealing everything she worked so hard to hide. He thought about Karl and Friedrich, safe at the farm in Bavaria, hopefully sleeping peacefully without nightmares about their father drowning. He thought about the 42 men below whose survival depended on his competence and decisions. Mostly he thought about probability and statistics and the mathematics of death. Every U-boat patrol was essentially a gamble against increasingly poor odds. Eventually, probability caught everyone, and the question was not whether you would die, but when and how. Hoffmann had survived 11 previous patrols through skill, caution, and luck, in proportions he couldn't accurately determine. The statistical likelihood of surviving a 12th patrol was minimal, but statistics only described populations, not individuals. His job was to beat the averages, to be the exceptional case, rather than the typical one. He lit another cigarette and watched the smoke drift away into darkness. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, cold and indifferent and patient. It would claim them all eventually. The only question was whether that claim came this patrol or some other. "See you tomorrow," he had whispered to Margaret. The phrase felt like a promise he had no right to make. A hope based on denial rather than reasonable expectation. But hope was all that remained when reality became too brutal to face directly. So he would hope and believe that belief might somehow purchase survival from a universe that distributed life and death with complete randomness. U-1206 carved through the dark water, her diesel engines rumbling with mechanical reliability, her crew working through the night to keep systems running. They were now officially on patrol, committed to the mission, with no possibility of turning back unless mechanical failure or catastrophic damage forced an abort. For better or worse, they had crossed the threshold into combat operations. Hoffmann finished his cigarette and descended into the boat to get what rest he could before his next watch began. Sleep was difficult, interrupted by dreams of drowning and Margaret's face receding as he sank into darkness. But even troubled sleep was better than no sleep, and he would need all his mental clarity for the days ahead when decisions made in exhaustion might determine whether 43 men lived or died. The ocean waited, patient and indifferent, ready to test them all. 3 days into the patrol, U-1206 reached her assigned operational area. Grid Square BE-47 stretched across 200 square kilometers of grey North Atlantic, positioned where major shipping lanes converged between Britain and North America. Merchant convoys passed through these waters regularly, heavily loaded vessels carrying war materials that kept Britain fighting: food, ammunition, aircraft, vehicles, oil. Each convoy represented multiple targets worth thousands of tons that could be sent to the bottom if torpedoes found their mark. But the same geographic features that concentrated merchant shipping also concentrated Allied defenses. Aircraft patrols flew constant patterns overhead. Destroyer groups prowled the depths with increasingly sophisticated sonar. Hunter-killer teams specifically organized to find and destroy U-boats operated with tactics refined through years of experience. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively against Germany by 1944, with U-boats being sunk faster than they could be replaced and trained crews becoming increasingly scarce. Hoffmann kept U-1206 submerged during daylight hours, running slowly on electric motors to conserve battery power, while Otto Brandt monitored hydrophone frequencies for the telltale sound of approaching propellers. The hydrophone system allowed them to detect ships from kilometers away by listening for the distinctive rhythmic beat of propeller blades pushing through water. Different types of ships created different acoustic signatures: the heavy thrumming of destroyer screws, the higher-pitched whine of corvette propellers, the slower, steady beat of merchant freighters. Brandt could identify ship types by sound alone after years of training that had turned his ears into precision instruments. On the third afternoon, Brandt picked up multiple contacts bearing 285 degrees. His young face showed excitement mixed with fear as he reported at least 20 vessels traveling together in formation. Hoffmann immediately ordered action stations, bringing the boat to periscope depth while the crew scrambled to their combat positions with practiced efficiency. Through the attack periscope, Hoffmann observed a major convoy. 28 merchant ships arranged in 7 columns of 4 ships each, surrounded by 6 escort vessels that included 2 destroyers, 3 corvettes, and a frigate. The merchantman rode low in the water, heavily loaded with cargo bound for British ports. Each ship represented a potential kill, thousands of tons of shipping that could be destroyed with a well-placed torpedo. But 6 escorts made the approach extremely dangerous. The destroyers alone carried dozens of depth charges and could run down a submarine at speeds far exceeding what WW2 could manage underwater. The frigate likely carried advanced sonar capable of detecting submarines at greater range than older systems. Attacking this convoy meant accepting significant risk of detection and counterattack. Hoffmann made his calculations quickly. They could position ahead of the convoy, wait for it to approach, fire a spread of torpedoes at close range, then dive deep and attempt to evade the inevitable depth charge attack. Success would mean sinking 1 or more enemy ships and surviving the response. Failure would mean death for all 43 crew members. But this was the mission: sink enemy shipping regardless of risk. And refusing to engage would constitute dereliction of duty. He gave the orders calmly, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline now flooding his system. The boat moved into attack position over the next 2 hours, creeping ahead of the convoy at slow speed to minimize noise while remaining deep enough to avoid visual detection by aircraft or surface lookouts. Fisher worked the mechanical fire control computer, calculating targeting solutions based on estimates of target speed, heading, and range. Hans Becker and his torpedo crew prepared tubes 1 through 4, each loaded with a G7E electric torpedo capable of sinking a freighter with a single hit if the warhead functioned properly. At 13:45 hours, with the convoy less than 3,000 meters away, Hoffmann gave the order to open outer torpedo tube doors. The mechanical clang of heavy hatches opening seemed impossibly loud inside the steel hull, and everyone held their breath waiting to see if the convoy escorts had detected the sound through their own hydrophones. But the convoy continued on its course without alteration, and Hoffmann allowed himself a small breath of relief. He made final calculations through the periscope. The lead ship in the center column was a Liberty ship, one of the mass-produced American freighters built by the thousands to replace tonnage being sunk by U-boats. She was designated SS James K. Polk, according to the name visible on her bow. Approximately 7,000 tons displacement. Loaded heavily with cargo, riding low enough in the water to suggest maximum capacity. A perfect target.